Aurora, Colorado in 1984 was an overall safe and pleasant place to live. That is, until a man with a hammer began attacking the residents. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Let's get started. Jim and Kim Hobbins-Child were a young married couple who were over the moon about just purchasing their first home, and they did so in the seemingly safe town of Aurora, Colorado. The couple was excited to move in. It was their first home. They were thrilled to start making it their own place. They were done renting, and it was just a big achievement for the two of them. Jim and Kim were incredibly proud of the steps they had taken together. Kim would recall that both her and Jim were incredibly social. They loved going out at night and enjoying the nightlife, and they just spent a lot of time as a young couple bonding and enjoying their town. But on January 4th, 1984, their lives would change forever. Kim would wake up and she was in an incredible amount of pain and she didn't understand why. And then she saw a man at the end of her bed, but he was holding a hammer. Of course, Kim starts to scream. She's absolutely petrified about this stranger being in her room and the fact that he's holding a hammer ready to harm her. But before she knows it, he's attacking both her and her husband, Jim. As the couple is being attacked, they're fighting back, but they're getting hit in the process. Kim manages to dial 911 and is talking to an operator while Jim chases after the assailant. And while Kim's on the phone, she suddenly realizes that she's bleeding, and she's bleeding from her head. And just then she realizes she's been a victim of this hammer attack. Jim wasn't able to catch the man that beat them, and he did suffer a severe skull fracture. A short time after, investigators would arrive on the scene, and they checked to see if there was forced entry, but they really couldn't find any point of entry that seemed like it was forced. Kim and Jim were asked about a hammer that was left behind at the scene, and they said this isn't our hammer, so it must have been the hammer we were attacked with. Detectives would take it in for processing, but there were no fingerprints on the hammer, so police assumed this man was wearing gloves. Both Kim and Jim were interviewed extensively about the attack, but they really didn't know much about the attacker. They didn't see his face. All they knew is he had a large build. Investigators would follow footprints from the scene of the crime until they came upon Kim's purse. Kim's purse had been rifled through, and it looked like the money had been stolen, but investigators quickly realized that they didn't think robbery was the reason for this crime, because the attacker could have simply went in the house, stolen the purse, and left. Instead, the attacker chose to brutally beat the couple, almost to death. 5 days later, on January 9th, 1984, Donna Dixon Holm was a flight attendant who had just arrived home from work. As Donna is pulling in, she opens her garage door, pulls her car in, and steps out. And as she steps out, somebody is waiting for her, and he begins to viciously beat her with a hammer. Unfortunately, she was raped and left for dead. Her boyfriend at the time, who is now her husband, his name was Ron, and Ron was a pilot, so he was out of town that night. But when he got back to their home the next morning and he went into the garage, he was petrified. He quickly realized that there was blood absolutely everywhere, but there was no Donna. And so he goes inside and he's looking for her desperately, and he finds her in her bed. She was rushed to the hospital where she did make a recovery. She remembers waking up on the garage floor and she's trying to get up and she keeps falling, and she's making it to the house and gets to her bedroom and she's thinking, am I drunk? Did I drink something? Did I pass out? And when she gets to her bed, she completely passes out and loses consciousness until Ron finds her the next day. So as she's in the hospital, the police come and they tell her, we think you've been attacked by the same person that attacked a couple, 5 days previously. And to hear that was just absolutely shocking to both the couple because they thought they lived in a relatively safe area. There was no violent crime. They felt comfortable with their home. So to be attacked so viciously while just coming home and opening your garage door really put the neighborhood in panic and absolute fear. On the very next day after Donna's attack, on January 10th, another attack would occur. But this time it was in Lakewood, Colorado. Patricia was supposed to meet her daughter Sherry, but never showed up. So Sherry called her cousin and she said, Mom hasn't arrived yet. I don't know where she is. Can you just come pick me up, and I want to go to the townhome and make sure she's okay. So Sherry goes to her mother's home, she lets herself in, and unfortunately she finds her mother beaten to death. And next to her mother's body is a hammer. Police would determine that she was sexually assaulted And of course, they questioned everybody in her life, but really couldn't tie any of them to the crime. Like the other two cases, police would realize there was no forced entry, but they did notice that the garage door had been open. Sherry said that her mother wasn't in the habit of leaving the garage door open, but if she had somewhere to be and she just ran inside, she would leave it open for 20 or 30 minutes. It wasn't uncommon. And then, of course, she would shut it later. Police would begin to wonder if that's how the assailant was gaining entry into the homes. And once again, the Colorado hammer killer would wait 5 days before choosing his next victims. I do want to stop and say this next part of the case is incredibly violent, so viewer discretion is advised. This time, the killer chose the Bennet family, a young family of 4. The family consisted of 27-year-old Bruce Bennet, his 26-year-old wife, Deborah Bennet, and the couple's 2 daughters, 7-year-old Melissa and 3-year-old Vanessa. Bruce fought incredibly hard against the attacker, but unfortunately, the attacker did overpower him, and not only did he beat Bruce with a hammer, he slit his throat with a knife that belonged to the Bennet family. After he murdered Bruce, he began to beat Deborah and her 2 children, and as he's beating the 3 of them, he rapes each one of them. Deborah and 7-year-old Melissa would die from their wounds, but 3-year-old Vanessa would survive. But the 3-year-old did sustain injuries that she would have to deal with for the rest of her life. Her jaw, her skull, her arms, and legs had all been shattered in the attack. She was incredibly lucky to be alive. And although the other cases were incredibly horrible, I think it's important to note that this was just despicable in every way. As he was murdering these victims, he sexually assaulted each one of them. This was a level of cruel that I don't even think I've come across in a long time. And just like the other families and couples that had suffered, it seems like the killer entered through the garage door. 11 days later, the Colorado hammer killer was in Arizona. Early on a Friday morning in January of 1984, Roy Williams was sleeping peacefully in his bed when he was jolted awake by a rock being bashed into his skull. But all he could see was a shadowy figure doing that. Of course, he fought off his attacker and was taken to the hospital. He would go on to say, he threw the rock, kabam. It was completely dark, so I didn't see a silhouette or anything, just a voice. But this time, the Colorado hammer killer wouldn't get away with his crimes. At around 7 a.m. the next morning, a police officer is driving and he comes to a highway on-ramp. And he sees a man and he stops and he says, "Can I see the sole of your shoes?" When he saw the sole of the shoe, he said, "This kind of looks like the footprints left at the scene at Roy Williams' home." And so he asked the man, "Can you come down to the police station for questioning?" The man would take off and begin a 30-minute chase with police officers. Luckily, police were able to catch up with him and arrest him. This man, Alex Ewing, was arrested 11 days after the Bennet murder. When police questioned him, he said that he hitchhiked from Colorado to Arizona on a Coors truck. So they would arrest him for the assault of Roy, but his trial was delayed for several months. Alex would do this on purpose. He did succeed in getting an attorney removed, so he would write from the jailhouse and say, "This case is taking too long to put together, there's no resolution, you're not doing your jobs, and I'm stuck here." But that would all change. The jail Alex was in was incredibly overcrowded, so it wasn't unsurprising when Alex was going to be transferred 5 hours away to Utah. On August 9th, 1984, a dozen prisoners, Alex included, were being transported. 2 deputies who were doing the transport stopped at a gas station and allowed the inmates to use the bathroom. So when they went to the bathroom, they had to be unchained, both their hands and their feet. Except Alex took this as a sign to run. Alex would run away and he'd make it to a nearby Kmart where obviously he got out of his prison clothing, he bought some red shorts and some shoes. Hours later, Nancy Berry was getting ready to slip into bed when she heard her infant crying. So she went to the kitchen to prepare a bottle for her baby. That's when she saw Alex Ewing standing in her house at her back door. Seeing this strange man obviously caused her terror. She ran up to her room where her husband was, and she was screaming as she did this. He would chase her to her room, and he would begin to beat her and her husband, Chris. And Alex was beating them with an axe handle. And at one point, she did get a hold of this, and she was kind of holding it and stepping back as she's fighting with him. And she said the next thing she basically remembers is she's got the phone in her hand and she's dialing 911. The operator would take the call and then they called dispatch. And the operator told dispatch, "This is the operator. I just had a call with a woman screaming in the background. Just bad. And it sounded like someone was beating her. You could hear like fists or something hitting." And police instantly wondered if this was the man they had been searching for. They sped to the Barry home, fearful, first of all, that the Barrys' lives were in danger because he was that violent, and because they knew they needed to capture him before he did this again. One of the detectives would note that when they got to the scene, the first thing they realized is there was just massive amounts of blood everywhere. They said it was obvious that Chris Barry had gotten the worst beating out of the two. The detective would go on to say that he was wearing white underwear and the blood had just soaked all the way through the underwear, and he was crawling through the closet trying to get away because he thought the suspect was still there. Nancy would say that her husband Chris really did suffer long-term because of these injuries. They had become a permanent part of his life. Nancy would say he was long-term affected. He lost his sense of smell, his jaw was out of alignment, so his bite was all messed up. He couldn't taste food anymore. His eye kind of was set back in his head, and then scarring. Her husband would die of cancer in 2011. Nancy did have fractures in both hands from defending herself. She was trying to cover her face and her head so that she wouldn't get beaten to death, so her hands were fractured. She also did have a head injury that required surgery. But police were terrified that they would find the children in a similar circumstance as the parents. Luckily, when the police went to find the children, they were unharmed in their rooms. Over the next 2 days, National Park Service rangers would begin the search for Alex Ewing. On August 11th, the rangers would get a report that Alex had been using a payphone. So the rangers would race over to the payphone, and they weren't really expecting him to still be there. But as they arrived, Alex was standing there. Once Alex saw the officers, he began to run, but they were eventually able to catch him and arrest him. I think it's really important to highlight that once this man escaped from prison, the first thing he did, besides change his clothes, was go and try to beat another family to death. So that should tell you everything you need to know about the type of monster he is. Alex was sentenced to 40 years in prison for the attack on the Barry family. And in 2018, DNA surfaced that tied Alex Ewing to the crimes in Colorado.
From what detectives have said, that the person that has done some of the other crimes has been described in the same manner as what I have described.
It's been 34 years since Kim thought about her attack.
I have not thought about this. I've not thought about it in a real way. And then when this happened, this was my worst nightmare coming true.
That nightmare started when a detective called her last month.
He asked if I was, by chance, Kim Rice, that had been involved in an attack back in 1984. And at that very moment, I just about stopped breathing.
That detective asked her to come in for a meeting, an update on her case.
And they told us that, yes, they have had a DNA match. And that's when the reality of it kind of hit in. I was very emotional at that meeting. I couldn't believe that they were telling us about all of this.
Jim was also there.
It's been a big relief, but yet it's still bringing up all the fear that we lived with all these years. I don't sleep much at night anymore because of that. I hear any noises, I'm kind of up all night.
It's kind of surreal, but when someone says there's a face, there's a name, and there's a person to put with this vicious crime, then I was like, geez, no, I don't want to do this. I don't want to go through this. I never even thought it was possible.
But the possibility of closing their case is real.
We hope so. Time will tell, because you relive it every day. So I don't ever not think about it. Why we live, we don't know.
And it was comforting to think this person was dead. It's sinking in. I think it'll be okay. I think I'll come to grips with that.
Police were shocked because at this point, they had gone unsolved for so many years. They were really kind of getting hopeless that they would ever be solved. By this time, Alex had been in prison for about 34 years, and he was trying to make parole. And by this time, he had already set up a dating profile. This man very much thought that he was going to get out on parole, and the first thing he wanted to do was apparently find a mate. He was looking for a woman who was 50 years or older, who liked to be active and go outside and hike and camp, and who was pretty much just athletic. Authorities quickly realized that they needed to bring him to Colorado as soon as possible, because had he been released on parole, they knew what he would do. And once police uncovered the DNA attaching Alex to all of these crimes, they realized that they had a serial killer on their hands. So at this time, Alex is in Arizona, and they say we have to bring him to Colorado to make sure he can face charges for these murders, for the crimes he committed here in Colorado. And at this time, Alex is about 60 years old. Police would interview Alex, and they would learn that his father was in the Air Force and that the family traveled a lot. Alex would eventually drop out of high school, and he would begin working odd jobs like carpentry. Alex did have spinal meningitis, and he said that basically led him to a near-death experience, which completely changed him. At the time of the attacks in Colorado, Alex had been there for nearly a year. He was working various jobs in construction, mostly working on new builds. Police would quickly realize that obviously he was using hammers because that's what he was familiar with. He worked in construction, that's what he was around every day, so of course they could tie his job to the violent way that he harmed these people. When police started interviewing him, they were very careful not to tell him why they were there. They didn't want him to know that they were there for the Colorado attacks. They basically wanted to warm him up and get as much information as they could before they told him. And when police told him, "We're here about the Colorado attacks, we know that you did it, we're going to extradite you, you're going to stand trial, we're going to put you away," Alex exploded with anger. He was just completely enraged at the officers. Police were able to determine that he did have a criminal record starting as a juvenile. At around age 17, Alex Ewing would begin his life of crime, and it really started as robbery and theft before it escalated the way that it had. Alex Ewing would find a lawyer to contest his extradition, and this lasted for 2 years before he was finally brought to Colorado. During his trial for sexual assault and beating Patricia Smith to death, Alex Ewing would address the court. He would go on to say, "Your Honor, I got a lot of issues right now. I would like to say to the court about this, but I've been treated so unfairly even before I was dragged to the state. The unfairness when I've given information out that could possibly lead to an alternate suspect, I'm told basically to be quiet. Prosecutors here are just going to twist it around. You guys don't want the people who actually committed the crimes. You just want the conviction." And he would go on to say that he wasn't going to testify because, quote, "I just don't like the idea that if I do say something, the attorneys will twist it around. Nothing has been fair, absolutely, since I got off the plane. The prosecution rigged the whole thing." In 2021, he was convicted of killing Bruce, Deborah, and Melissa, which would result in 3 consecutive life sentences. After a mistrial for Patricia's murder, he would be tried again, and in April of 2022, be found guilty of her murder. Authorities did believe he committed other crimes, but the statute of limitations had already expired on them. Not only was Alex Ewing a complete monster, but he seemed to enjoy it. The motive clearly wasn't robbery or theft. He never took real items of value. It seemed like he more so took money just because. Maybe he wanted to throw police off, maybe it was a red herring. But he attacked these family members in a violent and vicious way. Not only is it vicious, but he'd be exerting a lot of energy to kill multiple people by beating them to death with a hammer. He very much liked what he was doing. This man would rape 3 people as they laid there dying. And to me, that just is so disturbing on so many levels. He's an absolute complete monster and the worst type. I really do feel like he's the embodiment of evil. There's just something about him, as you can see from pictures. He just looks absolutely soulless. And what bothers me the most is, first of all, he denies this. He basically says, "No, of course I didn't kill these people." And they're like, "Hey, how's your DNA there then?" And he's just like, "This is rigged. This whole system is rigged." He seems like a complete narcissist. Again, I'm not a psychologist. I don't diagnose people. But in my opinion, he just seems very narcissistic. And he's never given any sort of motive. He's never talked about the crimes in a way that he explains the reason why he did the things he did. He's never given a confession. He's never said anything other than the system is rigged. So for me, although I don't know his actual motive or why he did it, I think we can all conclude that he did it because he very much enjoyed doing so. He was a serial killer, he liked to hurt people, and he did it as much as possible and as soon as he could. But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. If there's a case you'd like me to cover, pop it in the comments below, and I'll be sure to get to it. In the meantime, check out some other videos on my channel while you wait for the next upload, and I'll see you then.